Welcome to Classical Reflections. My name's Jessie Craft. Today, I'm going to fly solo. Not for any particular reason other than I feel a little bit like this episode, for those of you who listen, is a bit more of a personal episode, personal message. So it's almost more like a personal conversation between you and me, right? So that's maybe one way we could sort of think about it. I titled it Anxiety and Antiquity because I want to talk about anxiety and some of the effects and impact that it can have on us. Wanted to kind of delve a little bit into the history of it and see what the ancients had to say about it in Antiquity. I don't foresee me going into a considerable amount of detail, specifically about the some of the more intricate sociological and psychological aspects of it, of anxiety, primarily because I'm not trained in it. But I will. I guess I'll tell you about sort of why I feel that I'm qualified to say anything about it here in just a second, or even I guess even now would be a good time to do that. But yeah, so hopefully at the end, at some point though, after having sort of defined the terms, having talked about some of the symptoms, and then and some of the history, then I thought what would be nice is to sort of just kind of end things with some of the ways that a person could approach anxiety and even I hesitate to use the word cure, but at least a way that a person could alleviate some of the symptoms and certainly diminish them, and even in many cases diminish them a great deal and almost to the point that they are non-existent. Man, all right, so let's get started then. Anxiety. Well, first let's say a little bit about what anxiety is, and then I'll tell you about why I feel like I could offer anything of value to anyone regarding this topic. So, I mean, if we go to anxiety.org, we can find a nice little definition of it, and they say that now this is specifically for general anxiety disorder, and it says that general anxiety disorder is a psychiatric condition best characterized by worries that are excessive and interfere with normal social functioning. The worry is intense and pervasive, lasts a long time, and frequently occurs for no reason. All right, so this is just kind of the general, just a broad definition for anxiety. There are today, there are many types of anxiety. So it's all anxiety, but there are different categories for it. So a person could have agoraphobia, right? So like a social anxiety, and they fear going out into public spaces, or there are other more acute forms of anxiety, and certainly all important. Although my experience with them is limited, and so I will just keep this conversation to just anxiety in general. Also because the ancients didn't yet, they did make some differentiation, some precisions between some of the bigger types of anxiety, but they didn't get into the minutia like we do today. And so in keeping in proper form with Antiquity, and also just my abilities anyways, we'll just keep it in general terms. So if we go back to Antiquity and sort of look at how they maybe defined this term, we can find some, at least what I found to be some pretty interesting stuff. So for instance, Cicero talks about it. This is in his Tusculan Disputations. If you get book 4, I think it's like chapters 8 and 12, you'll run into these definitions here. So first we encounter this word angor, Angor. Angor. Angor is basically what he's using for what we might call anxiety, right? It's this sort of constricting disorder, right? So and by constricting, we mean like physically, in the somatic sense, that there is some sort of constriction, particularly on the heart and the sensation of the chest, right? Feels like it's hard and it's sort of heavy to breathe. But angor, this type of anxiety, Cicero tells us that angor is temporary, right? And then you have this other type of, still in the same chapters, same book, still Cicero talking here. He talks about anxietas or anxietas or anxiety itself, although, so that's a little, he differentiates anxietas from angor by saying that anxietas is a more permanent state. Now, what's also interesting to note here, and I sort of like these word etymologies anyways, is that anxietas, that word itself comes from the same root word that angor comes from. So you have this verb, ango, right? Ango means what? Like I compress, I disturb, I strangle, I choke, I vex, things like this. The verb being angere, right? To choke or strangle. So angor with that R at the end, though, that R tells us that it's passive, right? So in the first hand, ango angere is an active, so you're doing that to someone else, or something is doing that to something else. Angor means you, or whoever the subject is suffering from it, right? And the same is true for anxietas, or the word anxious, right? Anxious being an adjective sort of describing a person as being sort of anxious, right? But it comes from the perfect principle part, the perfect passive principle part, the third principle part of the verb, which means that it is passive, right? Now, I don't know necessarily why they use that principle part for the word, which means that it is a permanent state, whereas they're using, evidently, the first two principal parts usually for the present and future stems and imperfect. I don't know why they would say that is temporary, but at any rate, this is the distinction that the ancients made. Now we have those words, angor and anxietas, give us derivatives, right? So you think angst, which is a word that comes to us from German. Or you think of angina, right? Which is what, like that sharp constricting pain that you get in your chest, right? Sometimes could indicate that someone is getting ready to or is currently suffering from a heart attack, but other times it's just like what you call like a phantom heart attack, right? So you're not really having a heart attack, you're just having similar symptoms. Anguish, of course, I believe we are sort of familiar with what anguish is. But anguish is really like that somatic, right? Meaning it is like the physical manifestation, that somatic expression of anxiety. And in that itself, sort of at times can also tend to be a little bit more psychological, I guess as well. Okay, so what is this, what is all this though? This anxiety, what causes us? What constricts us? What causes us to feel distressed, to be vexed, to feel this choking or sensation of this heavy pressure being pushed on our chest, and we struggle to breathe? What causes that? Right. So, primarily, what we're dealing with is fear, right? Fear of the unknown, fear of anything really, right? And this fear that we have is then cycled, right, in our brains. Now everyone has anxiety to some extent, just that others suffer from it somatically, right? That they have more physical manifestations of it more than others, right? And that also has a little bit to do with how your brain let's say for lack of a better word, how your brain is sort of wired, right? Like how you're set up in your brain. You may be set up in such a way that you will cycle thoughts more commonly, more frequently than, say, someone else, right? And in doing so, you're going to experience symptoms associated with and derived from anxiety, right? Now, let's be clear though, right? Fear, anxiety is totally normal, right? And I mean, it has a protective feature to it, right? It's what keeps us alive. It's what, when humans were walking around in the savannah in Africa, right? And in those in those tall grasses, and they heard a sound and maybe saw a tail and realized it's a lion. So the first time you see that, that'll be scary, and that's in the present moment. But then after that, though, what's going to happen is anytime you get near that grass again, you're going to remember that there was that lion, which by now is probably in your mind become sort of a monster, this huge thing, which, I mean, you've seen it. You've seen probably that lion before somewhere. You are an ancient human walking around in Africa, and you've seen these things. You've seen what they're capable of to other animals. So you're going to have fears, right? A fear, a persistent fear of going anywhere near these tall grasses, precisely because you know what lurks there. And so as you're walking around and near them, even if a lion's not there, well, how do I know? I mean, you can't always see it, right? Whoa, shh. What was that? Did you hear that? I heard some wind blowing, like some grass and stuff moving. What was that? Right? So it's from there that your mind starts cycling, takes those thoughts and just runs with it. And for some people, they're able to get out of it and, convince themselves and prove to themselves, let's say, that the fear is not present. Others are not so lucky, right? But why would you be afraid of that? And what is this? What is ultimately this fear, right? So we might say that fear, what could we say? Is that it's really a fear of death, right? Isn't that what we are all afraid of? We are all going to die, but it seems that no one really wants to die. I mean, can you blame them? I don't want to die, certainly not now. I mean, I know I will at some point, and I could probably imagine some situations currently that if I were in them presently, right, that I would choose would rather choose death over living. I mean, there's no sense in thinking about them now, but I mean, I could imagine those. But I mean, just overall, I mean, that's kind of everyone's thing, right? Arachnophobia, right? The fear of spiders. That causes some people anxiety. What are you afraid of those spiders for? Well, that spider could bite you and you might die, right? Like, of course. That's that big hairy-legged thing with fangs looking at you that has the ability to jump, and some of them could spit and throw things. Man, that's scary, of course. Yeah. So the fear of death, or, well, okay, but someone could say to me, well, what about agoraphobia, right? Or like these social anxieties, right? Folks are afraid to socialize with people, and then they just withdraw themselves back into their homes, right? They're not afraid of dying. They're afraid of people. Well, let's think this thing through a little bit, though, right? Like, if I'm afraid of people, well, why am I afraid of people? I mean, most likely it's because I'm afraid of their judgment of me, right? And their judgment would be like a lack of acceptance. I'm afraid that I won't be accepted by these people. Well, what's the problem with that? There's no death. I'm not dying. Well, but that could lead to death, though, right? So if I'm afraid that these people won't accept me, and let's say that they reject me, right? If I'm rejected by my community, well, I can't get a job. Tell me I'm wrong, right? I can't get a job. If I can't get a job, I can't afford... I have no money for food or for shelter, and we know that eventually these things, a lack of these things, could lead to death, right? I would be willing to bet that just about any fear, I would be willing to bet that all fears could, in some way or another, be drawn back to this ultimate fear of death, all right? So we have kind of our source. We see sort of the history of it. But what about some of these physical manifestations? what does it look like? What does anxiety look like? So I've suffered from anxiety for, let's see, it is 2019, so maybe 10 years now, right? And now I think I may have had anxiety prior to that. I mean, I remember a couple instances very distinctly, oddly enough, when I was younger. I remember the first day of kindergarten, I don't remember if it was my mom or my grandmother driving me to school, but in the car, I started getting super nervous, right? And my stomach was upset, flipping over on itself, right? I didn't want to go. Why? I was afraid, right? It was fear. I mean, that's what butterflies are. You're afraid, right? But that's anxiety, and some of it's okay. Now, after I realized at school that there was no one there who's going to, maybe bite my head off, or that I wasn't going to be accepted. In fact, because I was, I made friends. So, that fear went away. I didn't have those issues. It came again one other time. I think I was going to stay the night at my grandparents' house or something, which I'd never done before. I may have been 7 years old at the time, 7 or 8. I don't recall, but I remember after being there for a couple hours, it started to sink in where I was and where I wasn't. I wasn't at home with my mother and my brother and sister where I usually was, but instead I was in this strange house with my grandparents. I mean, I know who they are. I don't think that they're going to kill me, right? But it was just uncomfortable, and for whatever reason, it didn't work well for me, and I got upset, and I ended up going back home that night and staying with my mom and my brother and sister. It disappeared after that. I didn't have any more until I guess maybe 2009 is when it came back. And what's sort of odd about that is the timing. I'd also recently just stopped drinking. Right, I used to go out and drink with friends, like you do. You're in your early mid 20s, and you go out with friends to a restaurant or to a house party or to a bar or something and have a couple of drinks. And anyways, I stopped because that's it's just bad for you, right? And I wanted to always I wanted to be in control of myself. And also, beer is just for your health. It can, for some people, not be great. You can have high triglyceride numbers and stuff like that. So I wanted to get my triglyceride numbers down and just sort of be in control of me, just be me, So I quit. But shortly thereafter is when I had my first, I know it now to be a panic attack. But I distinctly recall driving. I was traveling for business. So I was, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from home, traveling around. And I was on my way. I'd left the hotel to go to a Subway, right? Grab something to eat. And as I was driving there, I remember this distinct feeling of I was lost all of a sudden. I was panicking. My heart rate was through the roof, and I didn't know where I was. I had a navigator on. The GPS, I fortunately was mindful enough to follow that. But I was panicking. I didn't know what to do. I was lost. Then the wave started to die down. And I thought, man, I just must be really hungry. So I went on to the Subway, got my sandwich, and got back in the car. Then headed back to the hotel. I called at the time my soon-to-be wife, and was just like, hey, listen, what's this? I'm feeling this, and I don't understand what's going on. I feel lost. I'm not sure where I'm at, and it was just strange. And then I was having chest pains, and got back to the hotel and ate a little bit of my sandwich, and eventually, hey, those call a doctor, call a nurse hotlines, yeah. Which, by the way, those are great. And in case you're ever feeling anything, just call them, and they will usually they can guide you and give you helpful information. Although, just be careful, just be aware that probably 90% of the stuff, 90% of the symptoms that you describe to them, they'll tell you should go to the emergency room immediately. I understand it. They don't want to be held liable for stuff, and they're not trained doctors, and so they don't want to have issues there either. But at any rate, so I end up having to go to the emergency room. Although oddly enough, instead of taking a I know I'm rambling, but I took a taxi as opposed to, I didn't want to go in an ambulance because I knew how expensive that was going to be. So I took a taxi to the hospital, and I got checked in, and they, I was telling them about the heart pain, the chest pain that I had, and it was bad and it was hard to breathe, and they were worried that it could have been a heart attack. And so at any rate, I went back, and as they were doing my paperwork, I just kind of broke down. And then it was in that moment that it became clear to them. They went and hooked me up to a machine as well, just to be sure. But it was clear, I guess, at that point that what I was experiencing was not brought on by my heart failing or something, but that it was brought on by some deeper psychological issues that I had. And so they took me into a separate room, but not with a hospital bed or anything, just like a separate office, and they sort of just kind of let me talk. I just needed to talk to somebody. They gave me a prescription for some medicine. That was Xanax or something. I think I tried taking one of those. I didn't notice anything, so I stopped taking them. I'm not a big fan on pills or any medications unless it's absolutely necessary. So I didn't mess with that stuff. But anyways, it was from there that the anxiety started to. So that was my first panic attack, and then from there I realized slowly but surely that I was having anxiety, and the anxiety has taken me, it's run me through, all kinds of pain and suffering. Used to vomit in the mornings, wake up, didn't know what was going on. I went to the hospital several times, had all sorts of x-rays and things checked out, and saw that there was nothing there. And what was crazy, now here, after that first little spell of vomiting every morning up until, from the moment I would wake up until lunchtime, and then it would go away and it would feel okay, and I was able to eat and get on with my day and didn't have any more issues. But, and that went on for months. And when I finally, I go to a place in the school there to, I guess it was kind of they had, I guess, a psychologist or something. I don't know. At any rate, there were these professionals that you could speak with about these issues, these psychological issues that you were suffering from. So I went and spoke with them, and they put me on one of those machines. And gosh, I regret that I'm not able to recall the name of that machine, but it was really so they plug you up, they got your fingers in, and it's listening to your heart, and through your listening to your pulse, I should say, through your fingers there, and they had this machine with this computer with a little program, and you would just they had a balloon that would sort of float across the screen, and you had this nice scenery that would pass behind it, and they had this sort of really kind of chill music in the headphones, and lots of pipes and things like that, that you would hear, and wind instruments and whatnot. And they were telling you to control your breath, right? And through controlling your breath, you could control the balloon. And I was doing that, and so it was working. I would control my breath, slow down, think certain thoughts, and then the balloon would start to drop. It wasn't way up there, right? It would drop and just kind of hover. And then I realized, after a little bit of time and a little bit of research, that effectively what I was doing by controlling my breath is that I was controlling my heart rate. I was controlling my heart rate, and my heart rate was what was dictating whether that balloon would go way up to the top and just kind of bounce around up there, or whether it would come down and just be sort of calm, right? And just kind of float there in the middle. So when I realized that this was psychological and not something that was actually physically wrong with me, I wasn't dying, right? My fear began to subside. I began to lose some of those physical manifestations, those somatic expressions of the anxiety, until I found another stressful moment. And at any rate, I won't go through all of it, but I'll just say that, I've had issues with my heart where I had to go to the hospital a couple times because I was having incredible chest pain, right? Incredible chest pain, such that I really thought, I know I've had a panic attack, but this seems different. It wasn't. It was anxiety related. And then when I realized, when I was able to, in my mind, say, listen, I'm not dying from this, at least not today, right? Right? I'm not dying from this. This is from my mind. It's a creation there. When I did that, then the somatic expression moved and shifted and went elsewhere, right? So then I had issues with breathing. I couldn't take a deep breath. It was just these really tight breaths, and I would try to take this big deep breath, and I would just feel like I could only get so far. It was like I could only open my lungs to like 75% capacity, and I felt like that was going to cause me to die, and I was getting so worried. And then the problem with that, guys, is that when you have this one fear, then it cycles, and now you're afraid of the fear, right? Now it's fear of the fear of the fear of the fear, and it's this awful cycle. What other physical manifestations that I have? So I said the heart, said the vomiting, said the inability to breathe. I've had stomach pains, like abdominal pains to one side. I've had an issue with my throat getting really swollen in the back, and it was hard to swallow. And so at any rate, just so many things, right? Now, what I was doing though throughout there, and I guess we can sort of, maybe I could kind of transition. Let's talk a little bit more about the past and how the past is helpful, or how antiquity can be helpful for those of you suffering anxiety today is, so one of the first things I started doing was reading Marcus Aurelius. I had always liked Marcus Aurelius's meditations. I was reading them in translation. You know, when you're experiencing that anxiety, you aren't necessarily the best equipped for anything that's sort of taxing on the brain. And reading in a different language other than your own can be taxing. Oh, which reminds me, in fact, that is in fact one of the other somatic expressions of anxiety that I've experienced, and that can happen to any of you. Where you're speaking, but you're in a moment of anxiety, whether you're aware of it or not, and it becomes difficult for you to pull words out of your mouth, right? You know these words. I've said this word 1,000,000 times, but for some reason now in this moment, I'm not able to pull it out, right? I went to a workshop many years ago for how to teach children in poverty. And there was this former teacher who had now become sort of neuroscientist. His name escapes me now. But he was showing us some images of what happens to brain cells, right? During times of high stress, high anxiety. So you have this normal brain cell that looks sort of like a bare tree, right? And it's got all these big branches with twigs going off of it in all directions. And then he showed us an image of a brain cell in someone who, in this case, who was poverty-stricken, but what it was is that it was someone that was a kid that was under high stress, and so they're very anxious and just constantly worrying. And you know what happened? That tree, if we'll call it a tree, right? That brain cell, that tree, it seemed like the branches and the twigs and everything were missing at least 25%, right? So they were like 25, maybe even more percent shorter than what they were in a healthy child's brain. Now that speaks a great deal to just the actual physical the physical impact that anxiety can have on us. So, well, at any rate, back to how to sort of, what were some of the ways that I tried to, at least initially, get over this, and what can you do? All right, so back into Marcus Aurelius, I started reading him. I'd always liked his meditations, and I thought, man, let's give this a shot. So I wanted to share with you some passages. Then I would recommend that you read all of them if you are yourself in a similar situation. See, Marcus Aurelius, and like many of the others that I'm going to talk to you about, was a Stoic, right? And I'll not give you a textbook sort of definition of Stoicism, but just in a nutshell, what is Stoicism? I mean, or who is a Stoic? A Stoic is a person that might be best considered or characterized by their acceptance of who they are and where they're from. Now, that doesn't mean to the extent that they're not ambitious, right? They're not saying, so if you're born poor, you should give up all hope of coming out of poverty and just accept the fact that you will be poor for forever. No. On the contrary, what they're saying is that if you're born poor, you accept that as a fact. It's a reality. And it was outside of your control, by the way, which things being in and out of your control is also of major importance for the Stoics. But that's where you're from, and there's no reason to feel sort of shame or dishonor or whatever because of where you're from. And that shouldn't be what defines you per se, and that shouldn't be what holds you back from striving for something other than poverty, right? So this idea of accepting our position in life and taking control, right? You have ultimate control over yourself. You decide how you interpret things. You decide how the actions with exception, right, in terms of actions. But you decide how words will impact you, what you'll feel as a result of them, right? So it puts everything into your grasp, into your control. So if you're going to become angry by something, then that anger is because you decided to be angry, and you can't blame the other person. So in fact, let me just, if I could, I'm going to jump right into the Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. We're in book 2, and I'm just going to read through part 1 here. I guess we'll call it chapter 1, just to sort of impress upon you what this says and what their beliefs are. So he says, "Say to yourself first thing in the morning, today I shall meet people who are meddling, ungrateful, aggressive, treacherous, malicious, unsocial. All this has afflicted them through their ignorance of true good and evil. But I have seen what the nature of good is, and I've seen that it is right, and the nature of evil, and that it is wrong. And I have reflected that the nature of the offender himself is akin to my own, not a kinship of blood or seed, but a sharing in the same mind, the same fragment of divinity. Therefore, I cannot be harmed by any of them, as none will infect me with their wrong. Nor can I be angry with my kinsman, or hate him. We were born for cooperation, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of upper and lower teeth. So to work in opposition to one another is against nature, and anger or rejection is opposition." So that's the end of chapter 1 there in book 2. I'll go on and read one more. This one's shorter. This comes from book 9, chapter 13. He says, "Today I escaped from all bothering circumstances, or rather I threw them out. They were nothing external but inside me, just my own judgments." So see, he's putting all of this on the individual, right? You are within your full power and ability to control how you react to situations, which is true in the case of anxiety, right? Now, you can't control those external, you can't control spiders, for instance, right? But you can control how you feel about those spiders. And it will not be easy. I promise you this. It will take time. It will take training. It will take dedication. You will fail before you succeed, right? But with time and persistence, you will find a way to overcome this. Just for 2 seconds, Marcus Aurelius. I liked Marcus Aurelius. He helped me a great deal when I was suffering so much from anxiety. I've been mostly free of it, of the physical manifestations of it for maybe the past 3 or so years. You have the occasional thing here or there, but what I like about this is that Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, while I was reading it, you know what I saw, what I envisioned? it seemed like an ancient me. It read, Marcus Aurelius reads, at least through my filter he did. He may not read this way to everyone, but to me, he read as though he also suffered from some sort of anxiety. And you can tell that by his continual repetition, returning to those same thoughts, repeating to himself, why is it so important that I not give control over myself to someone else? No, but that I am in control of me and no one else may control me. Right? Now, Marcus Aurelius talks about the divinity, and that's fine, and that I'll just leave that out for this conversation. But throughout this book, it is a man struggling with the things which occur in his mind. And that for me was precisely where I was in that moment, and still at times where I can find myself now, right? Marcus Aurelius is not the only individual to write about these things. We saw Cicero. Now, bear in mind, in his Tusculan Disputations, when he wrote what he said about angor anxietas, he had written that just after the death of his daughter, right? So he is grieving, but he's also cautioning us not to grieve excessively, right? But that we should, because he was also himself a Stoic, that we should seek to control ourselves, right? And to be more reasonable in those things and more accepting of the things which lie outside of our control. There was also Seneca. Seneca, in his book of Peace of Mind, I wanted to share with you a little piece of it as well. Now, Seneca had this really great idea, saying that this is in chapter 10. Well, you should read chapter 10 anyways, of Peace of Mind, because that gives he's talking to a friend of his, and he's really helping him with how to overcome some of these some of the stress and anxiety that he's feeling about day-to-day life. Chapter 11, though, had this great little metaphor about a gladiator, and I thought it was kind of nice, and so I'll read that to you in full here. He says, "We dislike gladiators," says Cicero, "if they are eager to save their lives by any means whatever. But we look favorably upon them if they are openly reckless of them. You may be sure that the same thing occurs with us. We often die because we are afraid of death. Fortune, which regards our lives as a show in the arena for her own enjoyment, says, 'Why should I spare you, base and cowardly creature that you are? You will be pierced and hacked with all the more wounds because you know not how to offer your throat to the knife, whereas you, who receive the stroke without drawing away your neck or putting up your hands to stop it, shall both live longer and die more quickly. He who fears death will never act as becomes a living man. But he who knows that his fate was laid upon him as soon as he was conceived will live according to it, and by this strength of mind will gain this further advantage, that nothing can befall him unexpectedly.'" Right? This is very empowering. These are very empowering words from Seneca, who tells us precisely that it is fear of death that causes us to act as is unbecoming of a human being, right? And that our just reward for gaining control of our senses, so to say, of our thoughts, is that we will have a longer life, and when it is time to die, it will happen quickly and not be one that is drawn out over a great deal of time, right? This is precisely what we're dealing with here with anxiety. If ultimately every fear is because of a fear of death, then if we find a way to sort of conquer that fear, then we've found a way to remove the shackles and to live freely and to live as humans were meant to. He goes on, Seneca, in a book, his book called On the Shortness of Life, also a great text. In chapter 15, he said that life can be made longer by combining all times into one, right? So there's this idea, and now this is actually we also find this in Epicurus, who speaks to us at least through Lucretius in his On the Nature of Things, his work called the On the Nature of Things. And Epicurus says that thoughts of negative occurrences, whether they're in the past or the future, those are to be eliminated, so that one can focus on the reality of the present, which for him is the only time which truly exists, which is exactly what Seneca is saying here when we combine all times into one. I mean, the past is gone. Nothing more can be done of it. The future has not yet arrived, so it's not here. It doesn't exist. All we have is now. Now. And now. Now, what's great about this is that these Stoics were talking about basically mindfulness, like mindfulness meditation, which is kind of where I've gotten to today. I find myself now, I still read these texts because they're very helpful, and I still practice these things, and I try to help my students by telling them these brief little anecdotal stories about how they themselves can overcome these trying moments. But also the mindfulness meditation, which is something I've recently started. I'll sort of plug, I guess. I don't get anything for this. I'm just saying. Sam Harris, who is a neuroscientist and philosopher, and someone very well trained in the art of meditation, has an app. It's called the Waking Up app, and this whole app is dedicated to mindfulness meditation. Right? You should check it out. I mean, he's got a great little system going on there. The first 5 or so, I think, are free, and then after that, you could pay. And if you're going to do this, I mean, I recommend supporting people who are doing these, who are giving out information, helping others in whatever way. I mean, you give something, some contribution. I mean, I don't think that it's right that you give everything that you have. And certainly Sam, and nor do I think anyone who is legitimately of sound mind and reason. I don't think no one's asking this, but certainly you want to support people who are doing good for you and good for humans in general, right? But he anyways has a thing though where he says, so if you're not able to afford it, you just send him an email, let him know your situation. And in fact, I don't think you actually even have to tell your sad story, right? Or whatever your story is. It doesn't have to be sad, but and he'll just say that if you're not able to pay, then he'll give it to you for free, right? Just take the app and just do it, right? Because he knows it's that good for you. That's fantastic. But at any rate, so let's done with the commercial, right? So in this app, what he does is he's encouraging you to just be aware of now, right? To be mindful of the present. And this kind of meditation you can do with your eyes open, with your eyes closed. You don't have to hum. You don't have to sing. You don't have to sit there with your legs crossed. You can walk and meditate. You can meditate in the presence of others. The whole point is that you simply open your conscious mind, absorb, let enter what will enter. We don't want to block thoughts. That's not the point. The point is merely to, as the thought enters your mind, you observe the thought itself and you cast no judgment on it. And when you do that, the thought disappears. It's not magic. It's just what happens. It's just what naturally occurs in your mind. If you cast no judgment on a thought, if you do not purposely repeat a thought, it will disappear. Now, it is somewhat mysterious. We don't know where that thought goes, but it's also often just as mysterious as to where that thought came from. We don't know. Now, sometimes you might be able to point to, if I heard a sound, I heard that. I know what it is because I hit my fist against the desk, but where did that sound originate in your mind? Do you know? Look. Can you still hear it? You can't hear that anymore, can you? You could describe it because you have a memory, but you can't hear the actual sound any longer. It's gone. Right? And so what does that mean for us in terms of anxiety? And what the ancients were telling us, these Stoics were telling us about being mindful, is that now is all we have. And it's now that we should focus our attention on. And it's in this moment that we should also not give harsh judgments or to overly judge thoughts that come into our mind, especially those which are negative. Now, I would say that thinking of positive things is a good thing. Another practice that you might find beneficial, and this is something that I did for the longest time, is every night before I went to sleep. Some people pray. I think I mentioned once before, I'm not a religious person, so I don't pray. But what I would do, though, is every night is I would just repeat in my mind words which dealt with something positive. So I might just lie there in bed and just say, justice, honor, love, respect, integrity, caring, sharing, helping, right? Anything. You could even, and if you know more than one language, you could say those same words in a different language, right? The point is that you're trying to instill these words, this way of thinking into your mind, right? And the whole point of that is going back to Aristotle, right? Where he said that, if you are seeking to create a new character for yourself, right? How do you do that? Well, you have to work really hard at first. So I got to make myself do this every day through repetition. And then when you repeat something enough, it becomes a habit, right? And now you're no longer thinking about it. You just habitually just rolling with it. That's just how you think. You just treat people fairly. That's just what you do. And then over time, habit becomes character, right? So now, not only is it just something that you do without thinking, but it's also how others know you, right? It becomes you. It's a part of you. It's inextricably you, right? And so that's kind of what the goal is here with this anxiety. And if you're constantly repeating these thoughts, positive, loving, caring thoughts, and not cycling those negative thoughts of fear, the fear of death, then you can start to and eventually overcome whatever form of anxiety ails you. Now, again, I'm fairly certain that would work for all types of anxiety or depression. I don't have depression. Don't know that I have had it ever. And I don't know that I've ever suffered from other types of anxiety. All I know is that focusing on the now, on the present, not thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow, with the sense of dread, man, I can't, oh goodness, what shall I, oh no. Not doing that and cycling good, positive, loving, caring thoughts. I think these are all, if it's not the recipe that will cure, they are certainly the ingredients to whatever recipe is necessary for your particular ailment. And so I think even consuming these ingredients, right, even by themselves, and even if they aren't the cure-all, so to say, for your particular situation, they certainly are something that will contribute positively and in a great way to your self-improvement on your path to really becoming you, free of grief and anxiety. So I believe that has should suffice for now. I do have other thoughts about other aspects of anxiety and other ways to sort of alleviate maybe some of the symptoms. So perhaps, I don't know, perhaps I could do this again with you all some other time. Maybe invite someone on, and we could go a little bit deeper into this this thing which plagues so many of us, if not all of us, to some extent. So I thank you all for your time, for listening to me talk about my personal experience with anxiety and some of the ways that I sought to help myself, let's say. If you would like to talk more or have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or contact me on my website, magistercraft.com, or my Facebook page or Twitter. And I look forward to seeing you all again, but in a less anxious state.